hopefully by the end of this talk, you will understand and agree that bumblebees truly are the bee's knees. So I moved to Cornwall in 2011 to do my undergraduate degree, and that's where I really fell in love, not just with conservation, but also the outdoors and getting involved in fundraising and volunteering for different charities and outreach events. So in the UK, we have 3 different types of bees. We have bumblebees, which I'm going to talk about today. We have 25 species of bumblebees in the UK. We have around 250 species of solitary bees, and we have a single species of honeybee. A lot of people know mostly about honeybees. That's what people tend to have the most experience with. But bumblebees are a group of our wild pollinators, and some of the things that make them a bit different to honeybees are that they tend to live underground and they have different length tongues. So honeybees tend to have the same length tongue because within a colony, all honeybees tend to be the same size, whereas in bumblebee colonies, even within the same colony, they can have different body sizes, and that means that they have different tongue lengths. And different species also can have either short tongues or longer tongues. And this means that they're able to exploit a wider variety of flowers compared to the honeybees. If they don't have a tongue length that matches the flower, then they can do a behavior called nectar stealing. So you can see in the top there, a bumblebee's chewed a little hole in the top of the long flower tube and is stealing the nectar. Another fact which I love to tell people about bumblebees is that they do not produce honey. So honey is something that honeybees produce because honeybee colonies live for multiple years, whereas bumblebee colonies only last for a few weeks during the summer, and so they only need to store the nectar in its runny nectar form. And a cool fact about bumblebees is that some of the species, the males, have yellow faces and they don't sting. So if you see a male bumblebee with its lovely yellow face, you can impress all of your friends by picking it up, and you know that it doesn't sting, but they probably don't. One of the reasons why I chose to study bumblebees and why they're so important is because they are in decline. One of the major reasons for this is that 98% of UK wildflower meadows have been lost since the earlier 20th century. This is largely down to agricultural practices and increased urbanization. Another aspect that threatens bumblebees are diseases. So we know that honeybees can pass on diseases to bumblebees, and bumblebees can pass on the diseases to honeybees. But also climate change, which is something that's obviously threatening a whole host of species across the world. And the picture in the at the bottom shows the northward movements of one of our bumblebees, the Bombus distinguendus, and that's due to climate change. So bumblebees, if you've seen them, you'll know they're so fluffy, and this makes them really great pollinators in temperate, cooler regions, but obviously means that once it gets hot, they're less able to cool themselves down. And the figure that you see in the top right-hand corner, so that basically is showing the different habitats and how much nectar they contribute to the overall amount of nectar in the whole of the UK. And that's showing the biggest circle in the bottom left is improved grassland. And what's really interesting is, even though improved grassland is supplying the majority of our nectar, it's actually only being provided by a few species. So Trifolium repens, which is white clover, provides the majority of nectar in that habitat. So one way that we can support bumblebees is by improving the species richness of that grassland, so adding in more species. And that means that more bumblebee species will be able to forage in those habitats, and it would be a really good and easy way of helping to support bumblebees. Now I'm going to go through the bumblebee life cycle, because my research primarily focused on nest searching and then in the foraging. So in the spring, you might have noticed some really big bumblebees flying around, and those would have been the queens, which have woken up from hibernation and will start their process of trying to find a nest. It's super important at this time of year for a lot of flowers to be available because the queens won't have very much energy, and looking for a nest takes a lot of energy. This video may or may not work depending on my internet. What it shows is a bumblebee queen flying along low to the ground in a zigzag pattern, and it's this zigzag pattern that tells you that she's nest searching, and then you can see she's crawling around and looking for somewhere to nest in amongst the leaf litter. But as I said before, some species of bumblebee do like to nest underground in old rodent holes, but they also nest in a whole other host of habitats, one of which are linear features, for example, field margins, banks and hedgerows, probably because they use linear features to navigate. So if you put your nest along a linear feature, you're more likely to find that nest in the future. Some species are more specialist than others, so the tree bumblebees nest almost exclusively above ground in things like bird boxes, and they've recently come over in the last couple of years from Europe, and they're doing really well in the UK, probably because we love birds, and so there's loads of bird boxes for them to use as nest sites. Other species, like the common carder bumblebees, like to nest on the surface. So then we move into the summer period, which is where we are now, and I'm sure you'll have all noticed during this time, because we've, I guess, had more time to go out into nature and really focus on nature. Hopefully you've all noticed some of the bumblebees that are flying around, and this is a really busy period for them. There's loads of flowers available, the nests are growing, and they need to collect enough resources and grow big enough so that they can produce queen bumblebees, which will go on to make the colonies the next year. And hopefully this video works. It's a bit stretched, but this is the inside of a bumblebee colony, which is something that you don't get to see very often because they're underground. In the top left-hand corner, you can see some of the shiny nectar-filled pots. There are some lighter yellow cells which have larger larvae in that are pupating, and they've spun their own cocoons before they pupate. And then there are some closed yellow small cells, and they'll have a collection of eggs and small larvae in which are in groups as they are fed and cared for until they grow a bit bigger. And so finally in the autumn and winter, the colony ends. The new queens that were produced, once they've mated, will overwinter and hibernate underground, and then the whole thing will start up again next year. So really they're very short-lived, and they're only around usually for a few weeks in the summer period. So my research focused on how bumblebees use Cornish gardens and semi-natural farmland habitats throughout the year. And that's because we've just seen from the life cycle that they need the forage to be available for the entire nesting season, because different things are happening throughout the year. And at those crucial points, that's when they really need there to be a large and stable resource. So I wanted to explore these two habitats because they're quite contrasting and different. I'll go through that in a minute. And we also know from other research that residential gardens are really beneficial habitats for bumblebees, especially in urban areas. So we wanted to look at these big botanical gardens and see if they were kind of performing in the same way as residential gardens. So my study took place in Cornwall, because that's where I'm based, and that's where I did my research with the University of Exeter in their Penryn campus. And I had 8 study sites, and each site had a garden site, which you can see on this map represented in orange, and then a nearby farmland site. And in the 2 habitats, I focused on banks and Cornish hedges, and that's where I did my transects. And that was because we know that bumblebees like to nest search along these features. So when I was doing my nest searching surveys, I was knew that in these two habitats, I was more likely to find queens in these areas. And so in the farmland habitats, even though I might refer to it as farmland throughout, it was the semi-natural areas around the agricultural fields that I was primarily interested in surveying. In Cornwall, the farmland that we have tends to be quite small fields. So this is really different from where I'm from, which is Norfolk and East Anglia, where we have really vast kind of monocultures, often with wheats and cereals. In Cornwall, there were still quite a lot of cereal crops, and there was only one field actually that had a flowering crop, which was oilseed rape. But they tend, because the fields are small, that makes them probably more beneficial for bumblebees, because it means that the outsides of the fields take up more space, and so they have more of those semi-natural hedgerows and scrub and those types of habitats to both forage and nest in. And then we looked at these Cornish botanical gardens, and one of the reasons why we thought that botanical gardens might be more beneficial for bumblebees compared to the farmland sites is because they are less disturbed. So with the farmland, obviously you've got the crops and the changing of the fields throughout the year, whereas the botanical gardens are going to be more stable, undisturbed habitats. They'll also contain a more diverse range of habitats. So you can see down in the bottom left, we've got this open field with some trees, and then on the bottom right you've got a more structured kind of formal lawn, but then with lots of shrubs, trees everywhere. And a variety of habitats is good for bumblebees because it means that there's potentially more nesting opportunities as well as potentially more foraging opportunities. And one of the most obvious differences between these two habitats is the fact that in the botanical gardens we have a lot of exotic species, and in particular a lot of the Cornish gardens tend to be spring gardens, so they have a lot of rhododendrons, a lot of camellias, and so we were interested to see how the resources changed over time between these two habitats, and especially with these spring botanical gardens be providing more of a resource in spring, but then is it going to taper out in the rest of the year? So you have to bear with me because as scientists we love graphs, but I know not everybody loves a graph, so I'll talk you through it. So we've got the green, which represents the botanical gardens, and then we've got the blue, which represents the semi-natural farmland habitats. And along the bottom, it's going from early spring through to early and then late summer. And what you can see looking at the first part is that the botanical gardens, as we expected, are providing a higher number of flowers compared to the farmland habitats until around the end of May. But then all of a sudden in the early summer, we see this switch, and it's actually then the semi-natural farmland habitats that are providing a much higher number of flowers compared to the botanical gardens. Whereas in the late summer, you can see it's kind of comparable. This is just represented in another way. So the pink flowers are the botanical gardens, the white flowers are the farmlands, and each picture of a flower represents 1,000 flowers. So you can kind of visualize in your head at those three key time points, so early spring, early summer, and late summer, the changes that are occurring. And in the early summer, in the farmland habitats, the key flower species that were present were red campion. There was lots and lots of red campion. But interestingly, the bumblebees didn't seem to visit the red campion as much as you might expect, considering it's a really abundant resource. And actually, like we saw earlier for the shorter tongue species, they were mostly stealing the nectar, which is good for the bees. They're still getting a resource, but it means that they're not performing a pollination service to that flower. There was also quite a lot of bramble, and that is an absolutely incredible resource for bumblebees and other pollinators. you can see here there's a blue butterfly. And the bramble is visited by a much higher number of species of bumblebee, so it can support multiple different species, which is really beneficial for any kinds of plants. And as you might expect, there were much more species in the botanical gardens of plants compared to the farmland. And this is mostly because in the gardens, 74% of the species were exotic plants. So as well as the wildflowers, you're also getting this resource of the exotic flowers. And bumblebees are quite happy to utilize both native and exotic resources. And actually, we found that the bumblebees that we recorded in our gardens were predominantly foraging on the exotic plants compared to the native plants, which is something that was not really found in other studies. Usually they use both the plants types that are available. So then we wanted to look at also what bumblebees are using these habitats, and we found that botanical gardens were almost double the number of nest searching queens in the early summer compared to the farmland. And that's probably unsurprising given what we've just seen with the farmlands having very low floral resources, whereas the gardens were providing this really abundant early spring flowering resource. So if you're a queen and you're looking for somewhere to nest, then you're really going to be drawn to those high floral resource areas. Again, so on the bottom left, we've got the number of bumblebee species, and you can see this reflected again here. So in March, the gardens had the most species. In June, then the farmland had a higher number of species, so that's the orange. And then in August, again, it's kind of similar. But when we look at the number of bumblebees, so in the right-hand graph, we see that in June, actually, both habitats contained a similar number of bumblebees, even though the farmland was supporting more species of bumblebee. And then in August, we see that the farmland have more bumblebees, and that was made up predominantly by male bumblebees. And so one of the reasons why we're interested in this, looking at this over time, is because we wanted to know, if you're a bumblebee colony, you need there to be a stable amount of resources all the way through time, really, for you to be able to build your nest up, to be able to produce queens. And we didn't really see that in these two habitats. The resources fluctuated, which means that if you're a bumblebee species that can fly quite far to forage, then you might be okay, because you might be able to forage in the gardens and in the farmland. But if you're a bumblebee species that can't fly as far, then you might only have access to one of those habitats. And that would be something that would be really interesting to explore further, is the kind of long-term impacts on different bumblebee species of these two habitats. So finally, some ways for you to help bumblebees, because it's all very well thinking about the research that happens, but actually there's so much that we can do ourselves in our everyday lives that can help bumblebees. So firstly, you can learn to identify them. So you can look at their tails firstly and see what colour they are. So they'll either have a white tail or a red tail or a yellow tail. And then you need to count their stripes. This can be quite tricky because bumblebees love to fly around really quickly. But those are the two things that you kind of need to look at. And this is from bumblebeeconservation.org, which is a really great website for learning to identify bumblebees. And these are 7 of our most common species. And you can see that they do all look quite different. Once you get your eye in, they look very different. The most similar ones are the ones that are along the bottom, because the buff-tailed and the white-tailed both have the 2 stripes and then a white or a buff bum. And then the garden bumblebee, which is the bottom left, has a sneaky middle stripe. So you have to really look out for that middle stripe just above the wing. So it's actually got 3 stripes if you count them. And if it's still long enough for you to be able to count them, which is always the most difficult thing. You can also garden for bumblebees, so provide a range of different flowers so that you're supporting a range of different bumblebee species. Avoid cultivars and ornamental varieties, for example, things that have double petals. Plant in clumps because bumblebees are really attracted to really great resource clumps. And ask your garden centre about the pesticides and chemicals that they might use. Blooms for Bees is a really great website that you can use for finding out more about the plants that are good for bumblebees. And finally, there are loads of projects you can get involved with. So there's an action plan for pollinators in Wales. Bug Life, which is an invertebrate charity, have done an urban buzz project in Cardiff, which you might have seen when you've been out and about. And they also have produced the Wales Threatened Bee Report. You can also contact your local MP to tell them how much you love pollinators and what you think that they could do in your local area. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. I hope you've learned a lot. I'm just plugging my 2 research papers that came out of my PhD, which is about how to use thermal cameras to find bumblebee nests and about the predation of bumblebee nests by badgers. They're both open access, so everyone can access them. And yeah, thank you very much.
That was a really great talk, thank you. I've really learned a lot about how bees are truly living the bug life. But so I guess I'll start off the questions while because we've got a delay in the Facebook at the moment, so we'll wait for a couple of those questions to come in. So I think one of the questions I was about to ask actually links to one of the papers you were talking about. So I found it fascinating at the beginning when you were showing the image of the bees inside the colony. How difficult is it to get images of bees inside a colony? Like, how do you do that without, say, disrupting the colony itself?
So the video that I showed you is actually from a commercial colony. So farmers that want to use bumblebees for pollination, you can actually buy bumblebee colonies online. Bumblebees are really great pollinators for glasshouse crops, so tomatoes, peppers, like courgettes and those types of things. So that's actually from a postal order bumblebee colony, which is one of the only times really that you get to see them. If you found a surface nest, then you might be able to get a picture, but I've only ever found 2 bumblebee nests in my 5 years of bumblebee research. So
that's 2 more than me, so that's still pretty good. Do we have anything coming through on the Facebook at the moment? I can't see anything on the Zoom, but
I can't see anything myself, but I have a question to ask nonetheless. If that's okay. First of all, thank you very much, Beth, for an incredible talk. I really enjoyed that. You often hear a lot of things about the importance of gardening for bumblebees, and it's almost always about promoting wild and native plants and sort of having these wildflower strips. But I was amazed looking at particularly the little flower charts that you had. I hope flower charts catches on as a term and also a regular way of showing research. But the botanical gardens had such a nice stable level of flowering between the 3, whereas the farm sort of went quite wildly around. And it just made me think maybe the advice to always have sort of wild native plants. Would you say that instead having a balance of the 2 is quite important for bee populations?
Yeah, so the actual research on it is quite varied. In some cases, the bumblebees tend to use mostly the native plants, and in other cases, they seem not to mind so much. I think sometimes it depends on how specialist the bumblebee species are. So we have species that are generalist and they will just happily forage away on anything, but we do have species that are more specialist, and those tend to be the ones that are the most in decline and are more rarer species because they just really like to forage on specific resources. So for those species, native will undoubtedly be better, but I'd say for the majority of our bumblebees, then yeah, they're happy to forage on exotic horticultural plants, and in some cases it can be really beneficial. And I think especially we saw in the gardens, it was the exotic plants that were providing that really good spring resource, and they also help extend the flowering season into the winter. So the buff-tailed bumblebees now, because our winters are getting more mild, can have colonies that last over the winter, and it is mostly then exotic species that are sustaining them. And also the hotspot for bumblebees is in Asia, so if any kind of plants that we grow in the UK but that are from countries that bumblebees naturally occur in, then it makes sense that they're able to forage on those types of plants.
Amazing, thank you.
So I've got one more question for someone who's having trouble connecting to the Facebook at the moment. If they're out walking, how would they identify a bumblebee nest? Something you said is quite difficult yourself. And also, what's the best way to avoid disturbing them? As none of us like to be disturbed on our walks. I know I don't, but...
Yeah, bumblebee nests are really hard to find because they are fairly low in number in terms of the number of bumblebees that are actually in the colony. So honeybees and wasps can have thousands of workers in their colonies, whereas the bumblebee species in the UK with the biggest colonies only has around 750 workers. The picture of the Carder bumblebee nest that I showed, the surface nest, they only have around 50 worker bumblebees. So that's the main reason why it's difficult to find them. But if there's a walk that you do regularly, then you might be more likely to find them, because you might just kind of notice there might not be really any flowers around, but you might see some bumblebees going in or out of the same locations. That's often how I would find a bumblebee nest, because usually if they're foraging, then they would go to a patch of flowers, but when they're going to their nest, it will probably be in a place that's not really very flowery. Yeah, mostly when you're out for a walk, you'll probably notice them foraging, and they might do a cool thing where they use you as the kind of thing that they use to remember where the patch of flowers are. So if you're standing by a patch of flowers and happily observing some bumblebees, you might have noticed that one will fly up, kind of check you out, and then fly away. And that's because they have thought, wow, this is a great patch of flowers, and I really want to remember where this patch of flowers is. And you're a really unique looking thing in the landscape, and so they're using you to remember the patch of flowers. But in terms of not disturbing them, I'd say that in general bumblebees are quite not disturbed, so they will happily just kind of see you and just fly away. So I wouldn't worry too much. Obviously, if you found a nest, then don't stand right near it. But in general, the only thing you'll do is confuse them, because they might have made a very detailed picture of what their nest entrance looks like, and then if you're standing by it, you've then changed what the picture looks like. So you might just get a couple of confused bees flying around and not being able to find the nest, which I always find really funny, because they've probably gone in and out of that nest so many times. I don't see how you can make such a difference, but apparently you can.
That makes sense, and I'll make sure not to confuse any bees in the future. I don't often get confused with flowers, but it has happened in the past. But we don't speak of that. But yeah, thank you for an amazing talk. We do have another question. What boy is my face red? So we have a question from David Everts, and he asks, how do you count bees? Do you have to sit in one place and visually tick them off?
That's a really good question. We usually use transects. So in my case, for the nest searching surveys, I knew that I wanted to walk along Cornish hedges and banks. I measured 100 meters along those habitats, and then you walk very slowly. So you usually do a 10-minute walk from one end to the other, and you would then record all the bees that you see, because I guess that was my area, so I could identify them. So it was slightly easier. If you're not used to identifying them, then it's going to take a bit longer, but you can get some really good charts from the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and that will help you when you're out and about to be able to try and start to identify them. But yeah, you just walk very slowly in a straight line, and if you're doing foraging surveys, you would identify not only the bee but also the plant that they're foraging on, because then you can start to look at do different species like to forage on different types of plants, which is really interesting.